There is a scene from the winter of 1957 that Jean Tierney described in her autobiography with a precision that suggests she had returned to it many times in the decades between the living and the writing of it. She is standing on the ledge of her apartment building, 14 floors above the street, looking down at the pavement below, working out in her mind what the impact would look like. She is 37 years old. She has been called the most beautiful woman in film history. She has appeared in more than 30 pictures. She has been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. She has been romantically connected to Howard Hughes, to the future President of the United States, and to a prince of the most glamorous royal family in Europe. She has been the toast of Broadway before her 20th birthday, and the defining screen presence of Otto Preminger's masterpiece, Laura, a portrait of beauty so luminous that grown men in the audience wept at a painting of her face. And she is standing on a ledge in the winter air, 14 floors up, working out the physics of what happens next. She did not jump. A passerby saw her and called for help, and she was brought back inside, and eventually she would find her way to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, and eventually beyond that, to a quiet life in Houston, with a man who was kind to her and did not ask her to be anyone other than herself. She survived, she recovered, she wrote the book. But the story that brings her to that ledge, the story of everything that beauty extracted from Jean Tierney, and everything that the world's insistence on that beauty prevented her from being, is the story that the films, for all their luminosity, have always partially obscured. This is that story. The girl from Connecticut. She was born Jean Eliza Tierney on the 19th of November, 1920, in Brooklyn, New York. Though Brooklyn was only the accident of her birth address, not the substance of her upbringing. The family moved to Greens Farms, Connecticut, when Jean was 5, and it was Connecticut, its prep schools, its country clubs, its particular flavor of East Coast Protestant wealth and social expectation that shaped her in the ways that matter. Her father, Howard Sherwood Tierney, was a successful insurance broker who had built his business from the ground up and who had, by the time Jean came along as the second of 3 children, established the family in the comfortable upper reaches of Connecticut society. He was a man of considerable personal force, charming, ambitious, and not always easy to live alongside, as those who came to know him discovered with varying degrees of regret. Her mother, Belle Lavinia Taylor, was a former physical education instructor who had married into a life considerably more socially demanding than her background had prepared her for, and who managed it with the contained, determined grace that was, in that world, the expected response to almost everything. The household was prosperous and ordered, and in the way of prosperous, ordered households of that era, not entirely comfortable for the people living within it. There were servants. There was a German nanny for the children. Howard Tierney accumulated land around the family property, eventually building a more imposing family manor across the street from the modest original home. There were horses, tennis lessons, the Fairfield Country Club, the whole apparatus of a particular kind of American achievement that expressed itself in material acquisition and the careful management of social position. Jean grew up pretty, in a way that people noticed early and commented upon freely, as was the custom of the era. She was slight and dark-haired, with cheekbones of an unusual architectural precision and eyes that this is the detail that every person who ever photographed her remarked upon, and that no photograph has quite adequately reproduced, were a blue-green of startling translucency, the kind of eyes that appear to contain more light than eyes ordinarily contain. She also had, as she was entirely aware, a slightly prominent overbite that the camera found as interesting as everything else about her face. She was, in the vocabulary of her day, a beauty. She was also, as she was equally aware, a girl who wrote poetry since childhood, who played Jo in a school production of Little Women, with the focused attention of someone who has found something that feels genuinely right, and who was quietly, persistently drawn to the world of stories and characters in a way that the Connecticut social world she was being prepared for did not fully accommodate. Her education was impeccable by the standards of her class and time. St. Margaret's School in Waterbury, the Unquowa School in Fairfield, and then, in her mid-teens, 3 years at the Brilliantmont International School in Lausanne, Switzerland, a finishing school of real distinction, where her roommate was a girl named Maria Riva, whose mother was Marlene Dietrich. Jean emerged from Brillantamont with fluent French and the composed, slightly formal bearing that such establishments were designed to produce, and returned to Connecticut in 1938 to make her society debut. The debut was at the Fairfield Country Club in September 1938. She wore a dress copied from one Bette Davis had worn in Jezebel. She was 17 years old. The social calendar opened before her, the dances, the dinners, the careful management of introductions that constituted the debutante's primary professional occupation. She found it, as she later put it directly, boring. The alternative had announced itself a year earlier, on a family trip to the West Coast. Through a connection at Warner Brothers, her father had arranged for the family to visit the studio lot and watch the filming of The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, where Bette Davis was working. Director Anatole Litvak, encountering the 17-year-old on the sidelines of the set, told her with the directness of a man accustomed to making quick assessments of faces, "Young woman, you ought to be in pictures." A screen test was arranged for the following day. She read a Dorothy Parker monologue. Warner Brothers offered her a contract. Her father decided she was too young, the salary was too low, and she should come home for her debut. She came home. She debuted. She lasted 6 weeks as a debutante before she told her father she was going to be an actress, and her father, who was, whatever his limitations, entirely capable of recognizing that his daughter was not going to be redirected by social convention once she had made up her mind, said, "If Jean is to be an actress, it should be in the legitimate theatre." It was the most consequential piece of advice he ever gave her, and for once, the advice and the outcome aligned. She studied with the Broadway director Benno Schneider and with the celebrated producer George Abbott. Abbott gave her a walk-on in his production of What a Life in 1938, a part that consisted of carrying a bucket of water across the stage, and nothing more. A reviewer from Variety, seeing the 17-year-old carry her bucket with the composed dignity of a girl who intends to be very good at whatever she is doing, wrote that Jean Tierney was without doubt the most beautiful water carrier he had ever seen. She was not yet a star, but she was already the kind of person that a room notices. Her first real stage role, Molly O'Day in Mrs. O'Brien Entertains in 1939, drew a review from the New York Times that described her as very pretty and refreshingly modest. The following year, she landed the role of Patricia Stanley in The Male Animal, a Broadway hit in which she gave what the Times called the best performance she had yet given. She was, by the time The Male Animal opened, the toast of Broadway. She had not yet turned 20. On an evening during the run of The Male Animal, Darrell F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, the most powerful studio executive in Hollywood, was in the audience. He told his assistant to note the name of the girl from the play. Later that night, at the Stork Club, he saw a young woman on the dance floor and was stopped by her. He told his assistant to forget the girl from the play and find out who this one was. His assistant, after a moment, informed him it was the same person. Jean Tierney always had, she said afterwards, several different looks. It was the quality that made Zanuck sign her to a contract before he had finished his evening. She was signed to 20th Century Fox. She was 20 years old. She was, by the consensus of everyone who saw her, the most beautiful woman in the American theatre. What she was going to do with that, whether it would sustain her or consume her, whether the world would allow her to be more than her face, was the question that the next 25 years would answer. The man she should not have married. He was born into Russian-Italian aristocracy, educated in Europe, and had arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s as a costume designer with elegant manners, a facility for languages, and the kind of romantic self-assurance that women who have grown up in the controlled, formal world of East Coast society sometimes find irresistible, precisely because it operates by different rules. Oleg Cassini was 28 years old when he met Jean Tierney at a party given by their mutual friend Constance Moore in 1940. He was working as a costume designer, notably on Veronica Lake's wardrobe for I Wanted Wings, and on Jean's own costumes for the Shanghai Gesture, which put them in professional proximity before the personal connection had fully formed. He was witty and continental, and possessed of the confident certainty that he was going to be somebody, which in Hollywood in 1940 was both common and, in his case, eventually accurate. He was also, by his own account and the account of those who knew him, a man who was accustomed to pursuing what he wanted with considerable persistence and tactical intelligence. He pursued Jean Tierney. Her parents were opposed to the match from the beginning, and not without reason. They were Republican Episcopalians from Connecticut. He was a Russian-Italian Catholic, raised in Florence, who arrived at family dinners with the kind of political company that her mother found incompatible with her chinaware. He was also, in the candid assessment of those who loved Jean and wished her well, a man whose relationship with fidelity would prove, over the course of the decade that followed, both consistent and consistently pointed in directions that were not his wife. Oleg Cassini was charming and gifted and genuinely fond of Jean in his own particular way. He was not a man who, given the architecture of his character and the architecture of Hollywood in the 1940s, was ever likely to be the steady, faithful partner that the years ahead would require her to have. They eloped to Las Vegas on the 1st of June, 1941. She was 20, he was 28. Her parents were horrified. Hollywood society was entertained. The studio was not amused. A Screenland profile of their marriage 3 months later described it as the madcap marriage of tempestuous Tierney and the climbing Count, which tells you everything about how the arrangement was regarded by those who observed it from the outside. In the first years of the marriage, Jean's career accelerated with a momentum that had its own kind of beauty. She appeared in Fritz Lang's The Return of Frank James, opposite Henry Fonda. She made The Shanghai Gesture, an ambitious and slightly overwrought Josef von Sternberg production in which she held her own in the company of Walter Huston and Victor Mature. She made Tobacco Road, Belle Star, Rings on Her Fingers, Heaven Can Wait with Donna Meche, under the exquisite direction of Ernst Lubitsch. She worked with the great autocratic émigré directors of Hollywood, Lang, Lubitsch, Preminger, men who had exacting visions and short tempers, who demanded absolute commitment from their actors, and who recognized, in Jean Tierney's particular combination of physical presence and genuine intelligence, something worth the effort of their exacting expectations. She was becoming, picture by picture, one of the defining faces of Hollywood's golden decade. She was also, in the private rooms of the house she shared with Oleg in California, discovering the distance between the marriage she had imagined and the marriage she had. Cassini's career was suffering, partly because the studio system of the era did not look kindly on a man who was perceived as Mr. Jean Tierney, and partly because his own ambitions and temperament created professional friction that his wife's connections and goodwill could not always smooth. He resented the asymmetry. He was not always careful about where that resentment went. The marriage was punctuated by separations and reconciliations, by the particular turbulence of two strong personalities in close proximity with competing needs and insufficient stability. But the Cassini marriage, complicated as it was not the defining crisis of Jean Tierney's life. It was the background against which the defining crisis arrived in the early summer of 1943, while she was pregnant with their first child. The woman at the Hollywood Canteen. The Hollywood Canteen was one of the most celebrated institutions of the wartime entertainment industry, a club in West Hollywood where servicemen and women could spend an evening in the company of the movie stars they had grown up, watching, eating, dancing, and receiving the particular charge that proximity to genuine fame provides to people who are facing the genuine possibility of not returning from the war they have been sent to fight. The stars attended regularly and willingly. It was part of the war effort, part of the understood obligation of celebrity in a period of national crisis. Jean Tierney attended once. It was the only time she went. She was pregnant with her first child at the time, and in June 1943 she made a single appearance at the canteen to support the war effort in the way her colleagues and her studio expected. Months later, the baby was born prematurely in Washington, D.C., weighing 3 pounds 2 ounces. She required an immediate full blood transfusion. The rubella German measles that Jean had contracted in the first trimester of her pregnancy had done damage that the infant body could not contain and the doctors could not repair. Antoinette Daria Cassini was born deaf, partially blind, with cataracts, severely mentally disabled. Her mind, the doctors would eventually conclude after years of assessment and care, would never develop beyond the equivalent of an 18-month-old child's capacity. She would require institutionalization for the rest of her life. She would live like that, until 2010. Sometime after the baby's birth, Jean describes it in her autobiography without fixing a precise date, which in itself suggests that the memory was too costly to locate exactly. She was at a party in Hollywood when a woman approached her. The woman was animated, excited, clearly delighted to be in the presence of a genuine star. She told Jean that she had been at the Hollywood canteen on the night Jean had visited. She told her that almost the whole camp had been down with German measles at the time, and that she had broken quarantine to come and meet her favorite actress. Jean stared at the woman. She said nothing. She turned and walked away. She wrote, years later, about that moment with the precise devastation of someone who has had a long time to understand what it contained. After that, I didn't care whether ever again I was anyone's favorite actress. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. The price of Jean Tierney's celebrity, the price of being the person that a sick woman in a military camp would break quarantine to meet, was paid not by Jean, but by Daria. It was paid by a child who had done nothing except be conceived during a pregnancy in which her mother was attending the kinds of public events that fame required. The guilt that settled on Jean Tierney after that conversation at the party was not irrational. It was the precise accounting of a cost that had been extracted from someone who had no say in the matter. The story became, a decade later, the inspiration for the plot of Agatha Christie's 1962 novel, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, in which a film star's baby is born damaged because a fan had exposed the pregnant actress to rubella. Christie said she had not known about Jean Tierney's situation when she wrote the book. She was, reportedly, devastated when she learned the truth behind the plot she had imagined. The pregnancy, the birth, the dawning understanding of what Daria's life would be, all of it happened against the backdrop of the marriage to Cassini, which was itself deteriorating. He was having affairs. They were separating and reconciling with a rhythm that satisfied neither of them and damaged both. Jean was working, she was always working, through the years of private difficulty, because the work was what she could control, but the work was extracting its own costs. The studio system of 20th Century Fox in the 1940s ran on intensity and expectation, and the particular intensity of being the studio's defining female star left very little room for the kind of private grieving that Daria's situation demanded. And yet, in the middle of all of this, in 1944, Jean Tierney made Laura. Otto Preminger directed. Dana Andrews played the detective who falls in love with the portrait of a dead woman. David Raksin wrote the theme, one of the most haunting pieces of music ever written for American cinema, a melody that seems to carry within it the precise quality of longing for something that cannot be recovered. And Jean Tierney, playing the woman everyone believes to be dead, who returns in the middle of the night to discover that the world has made a myth of her absence, gave a performance that those who study the history of American film still discuss with the particular care reserved for things that have not been entirely explained. She was 23 years old. She was the mother of a child the doctors were gradually describing in terms that removed every comfortable interpretation of the word hope. She was married to a man whose fidelity was approximately theoretical, and she walked into a room in a film about the treachery of appearances and became the most famous image of beautiful mystery that Hollywood's golden age produced. The portrait of Laura Hunt hangs in the fictional drawing room throughout the film's first act, watched by a man who has fallen in love with a dead woman. When Laura returns alive, the question the film poses is whether the real woman can possibly match the image that has been constructed of her absence. It is, among many other things, the most precise artistic statement Jean Tierney ever made about her own situation. The real woman and the constructed image, the studio's asset and the human being behind it, the beautiful face that the world required and the person who wore it home at night. And from that performance, from the moment Dana Andrews looked at Jean Tierney's face in the portrait and then looked at Jean Tierney's face in the room, her position as one of the defining stars of Hollywood's golden era was established and permanent. What came next was everything the career promised and everything the private life refused to deliver. The long cost. The years between Laura in 1944 and The Left Hand of God in 1955 were, in their external dimensions, the complete arc of a Hollywood career of exceptional distinction. Leave Her to Heaven in 1,945 inches which she played Ellen Berrant, one of the most chilling portrayals of obsessive love in the history of American cinema. A woman so possessive that she stands and watches a child drown rather than let anyone else have a claim on her husband's attention, earned her the Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The film was 20th Century Fox's most successful picture of the 1940s. It grossed more than $5 million in its first release. Martin Scorsese would later call Jean Tierney one of the most underrated actresses of her time. The nomination and the assessment were correct. Dragonwyck, The Razor's Edge, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, Whirlpool, Night and the City. 14 films between 1944 and 1952, across which she worked with Otto Preminger, Joseph Mankiewicz, John M. Stahl, Jules Dassin, the best directors of a decade in which American cinema was producing its most enduring work. She was, by every professional measure available, at the height of her powers and her fame. She was also, in 1946, meeting a young man on the set of Dragonwyck, who would matter more to her than almost anyone else she had encountered. He was a World War II veteran visiting the set, dark-haired, blue-eyed, with a quality of focused attention in conversation that she found, as she wrote afterwards, striking from the very first moment. His name was Jack Kennedy. He was 29 years old, a congressman in waiting from Massachusetts, and possessed of a political intelligence and personal magnetism that coexisted in the way of certain very ambitious men, with a capacity for romantic feeling that never quite resolved the tension between what he felt and what he could afford to do about it. She was still married to Cassini, technically separated, but not yet divorced. Kennedy knew this. Her own husband had warned her, with the honesty of a man who understood the Kennedy family's political calculus better than Jean did. Jack can't marry you. No Catholic is going to marry a divorced woman. His family won't stand for it. Be sure you know what you are doing. She knew. She went ahead. They spent time together in New York and in Washington. He took her to empty rooms at parties and danced with her, and told her he could dance like this the rest of his life. He came to her mother's house in Green's Farms, accompanied by the kind of ward-heeler political companions that the Connecticut household received with barely concealed distaste. Her mother fed Jack Kennedy milk and cookies in the kitchen. It was, for a moment, the particular kind of happiness that contains within it the seeds of its own dissolution, because the happiness depends on not yet having to resolve the question that everyone around them could see clearly, and neither of them wanted to confront. When Jean asked Cassini for a formal divorce, when the question of Kennedy became concrete rather than romantic, Kennedy told her over lunch in New York that he could not marry her. His political ambitions required a different kind of life than the one she represented. She was a divorced actress with a disabled child. He was a Catholic candidate for the Senate with presidential intentions. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Her response, as she wrote it down, "Bye, Jack." The precision of it, 2 words. The diminutive, the dismissal is the response of a woman who has been managing painful things with composed exteriors for long enough that the composed exterior has become a second skin. What was underneath it was considerably less composed. The Cassini divorce was finalized in 1952. By then, she had attempted to replace Kennedy with Prince Ali Khan, Rita Hayworth's former husband, a man of striking personal charm and the kind of international glamour that the 1950s found irresistible and had discovered, with an accuracy of repetition that was itself a kind of message, that Ali Khan's father, the Aga Khan, would not permit the marriage. Another man who wanted her privately and could not have her publicly. Another relationship conducted in the space between what was felt and what was possible. Another goodbye that had to be managed with composure in public and was not composure in private. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. Jean Tierney, the woman whose portrait made men fall in love with the idea of her, spent the decade of her greatest professional triumph discovering that the real-life versions of the love she was offered were, one after another, love with conditions attached that she could not meet and that she had not set. The divorced actress, the mother of a damaged child, the Republican Episcopalian from Connecticut who voted for Nixon instead of Kennedy in 1960, the woman whose face the world fell for, but whose circumstances the world found inconvenient. By 1953, the pressure that had been building for a decade the guilt over Daria, the failed marriage, Kennedy's withdrawal, Ali Khan's family's refusal, the accumulated weight of public performance and private crisis began to produce effects that her professional life could no longer contain. She began to have difficulty remembering her lines during production. She dropped out of Mogambo. The part went to Grace Kelly. While making The Left Hand of God in 1955, opposite Humphrey Bogart, who had a sister with mental illness and who recognized in Jean's difficulty something he understood from close up, she was so far gone, as she put it herself, that Bogart fed her lines between takes. He did it quietly, without drawing attention to it, with the practical compassion of a man who knew what it cost not to. Bogart encouraged her to seek professional help. She did. She entered Harkness Pavilion in New York, then the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut. Over the course of her treatment there, she underwent 27 sessions of electroconvulsive shock therapy, the standard treatment of the era for severe depression, which Jean Tierney would later describe with the directness of a woman who has been through something and intends to tell the truth about it, as having destroyed significant portions of her memory without curing her depression. She fled the Institute of Living. She was caught and returned. The Ledge and After. In the late autumn of 1957, Jean Tierney climbed out of a window of her apartment building and stood on the ledge 14 floors above the street. She was 37 years old. Behind her was the apartment, and everything in it that had come to feel like evidence of failure. The failed marriage, the daughter who lived in an institution and would always live in an institution, the career that had stalled in the middle years of what should have been its greatest decade, the love affairs that had each, in their own particular way, made clear that she was wanted for what she represented rather than for what she was. Ahead of her was the mathematics of the pavement 14 floors below, which at least was certain, which at least was something she could calculate. She did not jump. A passerby saw her on the ledge and called the authorities. She was brought inside. Her family had her admitted to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, one of the most respected psychiatric facilities in the United States, the place where serious cases went when other institutions had not been sufficient. She entered the Menninger Clinic in late 1957. She did not leave until August 1958. The recovery, at Menninger, was different from the previous treatments, not because the clinic had methods unavailable elsewhere, but because Jean was, by this point, ready to be honest in the particular way that psychiatric recovery requires. She described the process in her autobiography with genuine gratitude. She was beginning, she wrote, to respond, to open up, to examine the disappointments in her life, her father's difficult nature, her marriage, the helplessness she had felt when she had to give up Daria. The moment of her release interview sitting behind a two-way glass, while doctors asked questions she could not quite hear, in her own clothes, without jewelry, applying, as she put it, for her freedom, is one of the most quietly devastating passages in her memoir. The actress who had been photographed by Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, who had appeared on the cover of Life, who had been called the most beautiful woman in film history, sitting behind glass in Topeka, Kansas, answering questions from disembodied voices, hoping to be permitted to re-enter ordinary life. She was released in August 1958. What she did next is remarkable, and not always included in the accounts that focus on the drama of her breakdown and the glamour of her career. She took a job as a salesgirl in a dress shop in Topeka. She served customers. She folded clothes. She talked to people who had no idea who she was. She did this deliberately, the Menninger staff had suggested it, and she agreed because she understood that the path back from the isolation of breakdown was through the ordinary texture of daily life, through conversations with strangers who had no expectation of her and no investment in what she had once been. The salesgirl in the Topeka dress shop was Jean Tierney. She was 38 years old. She was, by every external measure, at the furthest possible distance from the world in which the portrait of Laura had hung in a fictional drawing room while a man fell in love with the image of her face. She was also, by her own account, beginning to locate something more solid than that portrait had ever been, something that did not require the flattering light of a camera to sustain it. In 1958, she met W. Howard Lee at a dinner party. He was a Texas oil executive, solid, quiet, not glamorous in the Hollywood sense, not connected to any of the worlds that had produced the disasters of her previous romantic life. He had been married previously to Hedy Lamarr, which placed him in the unique category of men who had loved two of the most beautiful women in the history of American cinema and had, apparently, concluded that steadiness mattered more than spectacle. He was kind to Jean in a way that did not require anything spectacular from her. He liked her as she was, not as she had been. They married in Aspen, Colorado, on the 11th of July, 1960. She made a brief return to films Advise and Consent in 1962, in which her performance was widely praised. The Pleasure Seekers in 1964 before retiring from pictures. Howard Lee took her to Houston. They built a quiet life together. Kennedy's election to the presidency happened that same November. Jean sent him a congratulatory note. She voted for Nixon. The choreography of this, the woman who had said goodbye to a young congressman in 1947, now congratulating the President of the United States from a settled marriage in Texas, has a quality that is neither entirely comfortable nor entirely without its own kind of resolution. The world had reorganized itself. She had reorganized herself within it. The Houston years. The life Jean Tierney built in Houston with Howard Lee was, by the standards of what had preceded it, remarkable, primarily in its ordinariness, and she experienced that ordinariness as a gift rather than a diminishment. She had not been an ordinary person for a single day of the previous 30 years. She had been a star, and a beauty, and a patient, and a case study, and the inspiration for an Agatha Christie novel, and the woman that Kennedy could not marry, and Ali Khan's father would not permit, and the mother of Daria. The ordinary life, the civic causes, the Houston social world, the marriage to a man who read the same newspaper every morning and did not require her to be anything other than present was, by Jean Tierney's own account, preferable to everything that had preceded it. She and Howard Lee lived in Houston and in Delray Beach, Florida. They traveled. They were, by the accounts of those who knew them in these years, genuinely happy, the specific happiness that comes from two people who have each, through their own roads, arrived at the understanding that peace is not the consolation prize for the failure of excitement. It is, in fact, the thing. She continued to visit Daria regularly throughout these years, the institutionalized daughter who had been the pivot point around which so much of her interior life had turned since 1943. The guilt had not disappeared. She had learned, at Menninger and in the years after, to carry it without being destroyed by it. Daria was cared for. She was comfortable. The mind she had been given at birth, the mind that could not develop past 18 months, was the mind she had. And there was nothing that love or money or guilt could exchange it for, and Jean Tierney had, eventually, made the peace with this that the living require when the irreversible has happened. In 1979, she published her autobiography, Self-Portrait, written with Mickey Herskowitz at the age of 58. The book is, by the account of those who have read it carefully, a document of unusual honesty. She describes the beauty and the breakdown and the years between them with equal directness, without the self-serving mythology that celebrity memoirs of the era frequently indulged. She writes about Daria. She writes about Kennedy. She writes about the ledge. She writes about the dress shop in Topeka. She writes, with the clarity of a woman who has found the distance necessary to see her own life as a whole, about what the years of being the face on the billboard had cost, and what they had produced and which costs. In the end, she would have paid differently if she could. The cigarettes, which she had taken up in the early days of Hollywood as a way of lowering the timbre of her speaking voice. She had been horrified the first time she heard her own voice on screen, describing it as sounding like an angry Minnie Mouse produced, in the last decades of her life, the emphysema that would eventually kill her. The irony of this particular chain of causation, the voice she hated, changed by a habit that destroyed her lungs, is the kind of irony that accumulates around lives of sufficient complexity. Howard Lee died in 1981. Jean remained in Houston for another decade, living alone, participating in the civic life she had built, managing the emphysema with the pragmatic resignation of a woman who has weathered things more difficult than illness. She made a few television appearances. A miniseries called Scruples in 1980 was her last professional work. She spent her time quietly. She died on the 6th of November, 1991, in Houston, Texas, of emphysema, 2 weeks before what would have been her 71st birthday. She was surrounded, at the end, by the quiet life she had chosen and built. Not the life that the portrait in Laura had promised. A different one, harder and truer, and she had concluded, better than the alternative. What remains? Return now to the ledge. 14 floors, winter light, the mathematics of the pavement below. What brings a person to that ledge is never one thing. The biographies and the documentaries and the magazine profiles have assembled the list with varying degrees of care. Daria's condition, and the guilt that the woman at the Hollywood canteen deposited in Jean Tierney like an invoice that could never be settled. The marriage to Cassini and the decade of infidelity and turbulence that it contained. Kennedy's withdrawal, which had the particular quality of pain, of a loss that arrived wearing the face of a reasonable explanation. Ali Khan's family's veto. Same explanation, same pain. The 27 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy that destroyed portions of her memory and left the depression in place. But these are the constituent parts, not the whole. The whole is something that Jean Tierney herself understood and attempted to articulate in her memoir, and that the memoir's title captures more precisely than the contents always manage: self-portrait. The portrait of Laura, hanging in the drawing room, the face that everyone studied and discussed and fell in love with. The face that was, in the most material sense, the primary fact of Jean Tierney's professional existence from her debut to her retirement. And behind the portrait, the person who wore the face home at night, the person who went to the Hollywood canteen once and came back changed forever, the person who sat behind a two-way glass in Topeka, Kansas, applying for her freedom. The irony at the center of Jean Tierney's life is not the irony that the gossip columns always preferred, the idea that beauty is a curse, that the most beautiful woman in Hollywood was made miserable by her beauty, that the luminous face concealed a suffering interior. That is too simple and too comfortable for those who never had the face. The real irony is more precise. Jean Tierney's face made her famous, and her fame made her the kind of person that a sick woman would break quarantine to meet. Everything that followed from that Daria, the guilt, the marriage's decay, the depression, the ledge, everything followed from the specific chain of causation that begins with celebrity and ends with a stranger at a party saying, "I was there that night. I was ill. I had to meet you," she wrote with more clarity than comfort. After that, I didn't care whether ever again I was anyone's favorite actress. What she became instead, the woman in the Topeka dress shop, the wife of the Houston oilman, the careful and honest memoirist of her own disaster, was not what the portrait in Preminger's drawing room had promised. It was something more difficult and more sustaining. It was a life that she had assembled from the wreckage of everything that the other life, the famous one, the beautiful one, the one that audiences remember, had been unable to hold. Martin Scorsese called her one of the most underrated actresses of her time, and he was right. But underrated as an actress is the smallest part of what the record shows. The record shows a woman who contracted rubella at a single public appearance, carried the guilt of its consequences for the rest of her life, survived 27 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy that destroyed her memory, but not her depression, stood on a ledge 14 floors above a winter pavement, and came back inside, and then in the dress shop in Topeka, in the Houston years with Howard Lee. In the autobiography, she wrote at 58, with the precision of someone determined to tell the truth, assembled something that the word recovery does not quite capture. She had been Laura. She had been the portrait in the drawing room, the image that men fell in love with while the real woman was somewhere else entirely, doing something the camera wasn't pointed at. In the end, she had been allowed to stop being Laura and to be, simply, Jean Tierney. The woman who wrote poetry since childhood. The woman who voted for Nixon and sent Kennedy a congratulatory note. The woman who visited Daria, who was deaf and partially blind and would always have the mind of an 18-month-old, and loved her. The woman who folded clothes in a dress shop in Topeka and found it, on balance, preferable to being the most beautiful woman in film history. The portrait is still in the drawing room. It will always be there. But the woman who sat for it had a life that the portrait couldn't contain, and that is, finally, the more interesting story. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.